Welcome to the latest edition of PIGIP's IP Speaker Series and a series of workshops for the Right to Research Project. And the Right to Research Project is a project of PIGIP that's funded by the Arcadia Foundation. So that's the supporter of this and all the meetings in the series. And today we are having a session on the upcoming 43rd meeting of the WIPO Standing Committee on Copyright and Related Rights. And we're focusing in particular on the two main agenda items for that discussion, which is a discussion of the Broadcast Treaty and then the African Group proposal for limitations and exceptions. It's meant to be a guiding document structuring a future agenda on that work. And both of these are actually extremely long-standing agenda items, go back nearly or possibly over 2 decades. So we're going to have a series of short presentations and then a discussion. So we're going to start with Teresa Hackett, who's going to give us a little bit of an overview of that couple decade history, specifically on the limitations and exceptions part of the agenda. I will present on the two limitations and exceptions issues, and then James Love will present on the overall broadcast treaties, and then Dick Kuuya will present on the toolkit on preservation rights for cultural heritage organizations, and then we'll have 2 commenters from EIFL. So let me invite Teresa Hackett.
Okay, so thanks to PIGIP for convening this session just before the next SCCR, which is very timely. As Sean mentioned, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the history of the L&E agenda at WIPO. So just take note that I'm talking about the specific agenda item and limitations and exceptions, or L&Es as we call them. I won't be talking about the topic of limitations and exceptions in the broadcast treaty, which is going to be which will be dealt with by some of the other speakers, including Jamie, who's coming on after me. So I'm going to structure my comments as follows, which are the milestones by date, studies, proposals by member states, action plans on limitations and exceptions, and then bringing us right up to date with the African Group proposal for a work plan. Now, of course, all of these activities were happening in parallel throughout the years, almost 2 decades, as Sean mentioned. But what we can see is that the work on limitations and exceptions at the WIPO Standing Committee on Copyright has been substantial. So there's been a great body of work done on L&Es. It's been substantive. So there's been a lot of very considered proposals by member states. It's also been successful because, as Sean mentioned, one of the outcomes of this particular agenda item was the Marrakesh Treaty for people with print disabilities. And what we can also see is that there's been a lot of engagement from member states throughout the years, in particular from developing countries. And that countries from the global south have really been the leaders leading on this work on exceptions and limitations. So just looking briefly at the milestones by date, the very first proposal on L&Es was a proposal by Chile to include limitations and exceptions for education, libraries, and disabilities into the agenda item on other issues at the time. Then in 2007, the WIPO General Assembly adopted a development agenda with 45 recommendations for IP and development. And in particular, there's a number of recommendations in Cluster B, which are directly relevant to the work of the SCCR. So there's provisions, recommendations on norm setting, flexibility, public domain, and public policy. And that was an important context that gave a concrete context to the work and the discussions that were in their very early stages at the SCCR. Then in 2008, we had the first work plan proposal on L&Es, which was by Brazil, Chile, Nicaragua, and Uruguay. And at that meeting, limitations and exceptions became a standalone item on the agenda, and that remains the case until today. Then the following year, the first treaty proposal on limitations and exceptions was made by Brazil, Ecuador, and Paraguay, which was based on a text by the World Blind Union for persons with print disabilities. Then the following year, 2010, the African group made their first proposal for a draft treaty for persons with disabilities, education and research, libraries and archives. The following year, again, there was a first treaty proposal focused on the libraries and archives, and that was in the form of a background paper presented by Brazil. And the background paper was drafted by the communities ourselves, by our own organization, EIFL, ICA, and Innovate, and presented by Brazil to the member states. Then in 2012, the General Assembly gave a mandate to the SCCR to continue discussion to work towards an appropriate international legal instrument or instruments, whether model law, joint recommendation, treaty, and or other forms. And that's the mandate under which the SCCR currently works on limitations and exceptions. And you'll see the language from that mandate appearing in documents, subsequent documents, and current documents that are related to this topic. Then in 2013, of course, the Marrakesh Treaty for Persons with Print Disabilities was adopted by member states, a great achievement and a landmark moment for all of us. And in 2020, the Marrakesh Treaty was ratified by 100 member states, so relatively soon after the treaty was adopted in treaty terms, confirming its place as WIPO's most successful and fastest growing treaty of recent times. So it was a great success that came directly out as a result of this work at SCCR. So then my comments from now on will really focus on the other issues. So that's libraries, archives and museums, or LAMS for short, education and research, and other disabilities. So in the WIPO context, or in the SCCR context, other disabilities means disabilities that were not already covered by the Marrakesh Treaty for persons with print disabilities. So for example, for people who are deaf. And that's an outstanding agenda item, and if you like to say, some unfinished business from those discussions at SCCR. So there have been a number of studies on libraries, archives and museums, which have all over the years been updated and revised. We have the study, most recent study from 2017 by Kenneth Cruz on limitations and exceptions globally. There have been typologies, background papers, reports, also on archives and museums as well. Then for education and research, the first set of studies on education, on limitations and exceptions for education focused on teaching, and they were a series of regional studies. The first study in Africa was in 2009 by Professor Fomito, for example. Then later on, the Professor Singh from Singapore, he did a global analysis of limitations and exceptions in one single study. And again, those studies have been updated. Then there was reports, particularly looking at online distance education and research. And then coming up at the next SCCR, there will be a presentation of a scoping study on LMEs for research. So all of the previous studies had touched upon research. Many of them were focusing really on education and teaching. So this one is going to look particularly at research. And then for other disabilities, there was a scoping study on other disabilities presented in 2019. Then in terms of proposals by member states, so we had in 2011, the African group updated its proposal for a draft treaty for persons with disabilities, education, and for libraries and archives. The US updated its proposal on objectives and principles for libraries and archives. And then in the same year, there was a working document put together, assembled by the Secretariat at the request of member states, which brought together all of the text-based suggestions and the comments from member states on libraries and archives and education, teaching and research. And that document the library document was adopted in at the SCCR 26, and then there was a provisional version for education and teaching. And that's a kind of an interesting document if you're looking back at the history and what are the proposals from member states, because it contains all of the proposals and all of the comments. And you can see here a range of the range of countries that contributed. So we have proposals by African group, by GRULAC, individual countries, Brazil, Ecuador, Uruguay, India, Pakistan, China, US, and then all of the comments. So a lot of engagement by member states. Then in 2014, the US submitted objectives and principles for education, teaching, and research. And then the African group, Brazil, Ecuador, India, and Uruguay submitted a consolidation of the proposed text on libraries and archives. So that's the text, the text-based proposals that were in that previous consolidated document. So they took out and identified 11 different topics related to libraries and archives. And the idea was to try and sort of focus in on specific topics and to get some consensus from the member states on those topics. Then in 2016, Argentina made a proposal for a possible LNE instrument on allowing for works to be used across borders. So that's a specific proposal on cross-border uses, which is quite interesting. Then as a result of all of that work, in 2017, the then chair of the SCCR prepared a chart on LNEs, which set out the principles of the topic, the concerns, and a suggested approach by member states. And as a result of that exercise, for example, one of the 11 library topics, it was decided not to include in future discussions, which was legal deposit, because strictly speaking, legal deposit is not a limitation or exception. So this was an attempt by the member states to really, narrow down the topics and, as I say, come to some consensus. Then we're moving on to the 2018 and 2019, where there was an action plan prepared, which was to provide the committee with suggestions on areas where international cooperation would be needed. And as part of that action plan, some of the studies I talked about earlier were updated. And there was a series of regional seminars in 3 regions of the world, in Singapore, in Nairobi, and in Santo Domingo, that brought together the local policymakers and civil society to discuss the topic of limitations and exceptions, followed by an international conference in Geneva in October 2019. And then that resulted in a report by the Secretariat of the seminars. It gave a summary of the discussions, suggestions on the way forward, and how the issue could progress into the future. In general, in summary, there was one can say that there was a conclusion that there was a lack of exceptions in the majority of countries, in particular for preservation of cultural heritage and communications for online learning and research, and cross-border uses for education, research, and the activities of land. So these were the 3 topics that were highlighted where there was a consensus on the need for action in those areas. And then more generally, the member states, the discussion evolved to say that members to work on LNE should continue in a forward-looking way. WIPO should provide some legislative and technical assistance, especially for cross-border uses, and they should develop a range of tools like models and recommendations and guidance and so on, including toolkits on LNE. That was back in the international conference was in October 2019, and of course, the following year, COVID hit, and there was a hiatus or a moratorium, if you like, on discussions at WIPO due to the travel restrictions and so on. But I think what's important is that COVID highlighted the importance of the discussions that have been taking place. It highlighted the importance of limitations and exceptions and flexibility. And what we saw, what we all experienced, was that the problems created by the fact that there were different rules for online and offline teaching, that the terms in e-resource licenses didn't fulfill needs during lockdown. So for example, if your e-resource license said limited use to walk-in users, well, there weren't any walk-in users during lockdown. And it also highlighted the critical role of the digital research tools like text and data mining, and how important it was to quickly share your research results with other researchers around the world that were trying to solve, trying to identify solutions for the COVID crisis. Then, and I'm going to divert just very, very briefly for a moment on what some of the community responses were to the COVID. So research libraries were calling on the European Commission in Europe to issue urgent guidance so that libraries and researchers could do their work during the lockdowns without fear of litigation. Our friends in the US reaffirmed the role of fair use in supporting remote teaching and research. And then the publishers temporarily lifted restrictions on certain e-resources during those critical times. Governments also responded. So Hungary issued a decree easing copyright rules for online education in an emergency. Japan and Australia both brought forward some proposals that were already in the pipeline to address online teaching. The European Commission asked publishers to make their scientific journals related to COVID publications and data immediately available to support the public health efforts. And UNESCO mobilized 122 countries to promote open science, including by shaping and making universally available research results. And limitations and exceptions are part of that environment that is needed to support open science. So then the question comes back to WIPO and SCCR. So what can WIPO do and what can SCCR do about this? Well, it's an opportunity for SCCR to provide global guidance for future crises, future pandemics, or for the impact of other global challenges such as climate change. So looking then at the work plan, the current work plan where the African group, when the negotiations started again and travel restrictions were lifted last year at the SCCR, the African group made a new proposal for a work plan on limitations and exceptions. So the work plan reaffirms the 2012 mandate. It said that the work should reflect the priorities that were identified in the report from the regional conferences and the international conference at WIPO, that all laws should enable preservation and use of preserved material, and that exceptions to promote online education and research, including across borders, should be a priority. Also, that there should be expert presentations on choice of law for cross-border issues, looking, for example, at how the EU is dealing with that, and the Argentine proposal that I mentioned earlier. That there could be a Friends of the Chair convened to prepare objectives or models, information sessions on different issues, and to develop toolkits to craft laws and policies that support education, research, and cultural participation. So coming up at the SCCR next week, there will be a presentation by the Secretariat of a toolkit on preservation, presentation for a scoping study on research exceptions, the holding of an expert session on cross-border issues, and then an invitation to the African group to update their proposal for a work plan. And then the discussion will be open for member states and NGOs and IGOs to comment on possible next steps. So that's a very quick overview of an almost 2-decade history of LNEs at the SCCR. If I've left anything out, or if there's any comments or corrections, please shoot me a message and I'll be glad to update I'll be glad to update the presentation for next time. So with that, I'm going to hand back to